Charlie! Lola? Charlie! Charlie and Lola! But where completely are we?
I have this little sister, Lola. What are you doing, Lola?
I'm being a tent, Charlie.
She's small and very funny.
Who lives in tents?
Explorers live in tents when they go exploring.
Exploring?
Yes, it's like really exciting camping.
Oh, where do they do exploring?
They go all over the whole world. To hot deserts, which are all sand.
Ooh!
To great big rocky canyons.
More baked beans, please.
They even climb whole mountains for the very first time.
We made it!
And when they get to the pointiest peak, they stick a flag in the top.
I would quite like to be an explorer. Why don't we go now?
All the exploring places are really far away, and you have to take water and food for surviving.
We can do that.
Explorers must always prepare properly.
I know, Charlie. That's why I'm taking absolutely, completely everything. Just in case.
Lola? How are you going to carry all that up a mountain? Or run away from elephants?
Easy peasy. See?
But Lola, you have to choose carefully.
Oh, OK then.
Tent, binoculars for spotting wild animals, string for tying things, notebook and pen, water, food, and...
Glitter, in case we need to do some colouring and sticking.
OK. Ah.
Mum gave me some raisins, in case we get really hungry out in the wild. And Dad said he'll come down if we need some help with the tent.
You won't need any help, Lola, because we're explorers.
I know. Where are we going?
We're going through blizzards and tropical rain.
And jump over biggish rocks.
We may even have to wade through rivers. But we'll keep on going and going until we get there.
Where? Where are we going?
Somewhere we can have a real adventure, like here.
But where completely are we?
I think we must be in the Amazon rainforest.
Ooh.
Look at all the hundreds and hundreds of trees.
Ooh.
Mrs. Finch told us that the very top bit of the rainforest is called the canopy.
Ooh.
And on the forest floor there are lots of creepy crawlies.
Oh. Charlie!
That one.
Is this where we're going to make our rainforest camp?
Uh-huh.
Shall I go and get my tea set and some spoons?
Why don't you find a place for our food supplies that won't attract bears and tigers?
Tigers?
Yes, it's very important not to keep your food supplies outside your actual tent in case hungry jungle animals spot it and come for a lunchtime snack.
Hungry jungle animals?
That piece goes there and this one there. That's a good tent.
What? Can we have a little snack now?
That's a good idea. I'm hungry.
Finished.
Lola, you can't do that. You always have to save something to drink in the jungle.
That's okay, Charlie. I told Mum I would need lots of pink milk if I was going exploring.
You're not supposed to bring extra supplies.
Oh, would you like orange juice more instead of pink milk? I can go and get some.
No, Lola. We can't just go back home every time we want something.
Can't we?
No, that's cheating. We're in a wild and faraway place, remember? And we have to find our own food.
Oh, yes.
We can survive in the Amazon rainforest by ourselves.
Oh.
I'll look for food and you see if you can discover a whole new kind of actual plant.
All right, Charlie.
Lola, it's me.
Ooh, I thought you were a tiger.
Sorry, Lola. I was just foraging for food in the bush. Do you want to go back to the camp for a bit?
Yes. Then I can share my raisins with you. Are there really bears and tigers in the jungle?
Yes, Lola.
Oh. Could I just go upstairs quickly and get Foxy? I think he liked the jungle and he could protect us from the tigers and things.
Lola, I told you. We can't go home when we're exploring. Anyway, explorers don't take toys on their adventures.
Not even Foxy?
Nope.
Oh. It's raining, Charlie.
Quick, Lola. When it rains in the Amazon, it rains lots. You better get in the tent. Wow, a proper rainforest storm. We could be here for days.
I don't like it when it's rainy. Mum said if it rained, we could go back upstairs, Charlie.
But real-life explorers don't go back upstairs.
It's raining a very lot.
Why don't you show me the drawing of the tree we did in the jungle?
Yes! Oh no! I left my drawing book and my Lola tree out in the pouring rain. It will be all wet and soggy now. Oh. I definitely don't like explorer camping. It's wet and it's cold. I don't like it. Please. Can we just go inside? Please?
And then I had a really good idea.
Hurry up, Charlie.
This will be great.
Yum. Thanks, Mum. Foxy. This will be useful. There. Ta-da!
Indoor, outdoor camping.
Yes! I can camp inside of the doors and outside of the doors. Indoor camping, outdoor camping.
And we're really high up. It's like living right in the top of the trees.
The canopy, Charlie. It's an actual treehouse camp. A tent in the trees.
It's a canopy camp. I bet no one has ever explored from a canopy camp.
It's very extremely exciting.
Shh, Lola, a jungle creature.
Where?
Look, up in that tree. Tree frogs! Hop on!
Follow me! Hello, parrot. Hello, parrot. Ooh, a big orangey monkey, Charlie. They're called orangutans. Lots of orangutans.
parrots and saw 23 orangutans. Lola, when are you going to tidy your side of the camp?
Not now, Charlie.
Where are you going?
Foraging.
Foraging for what? Giant coconuts?
No, cheese from the fridge.